The call came at 3:47 a.m., piercing through the humid Buenos Aires night like a blade through silk. Valentina Arce had been awake anyway, sitting at her apartment window in Palermo, watching the city that never truly slept wrestle with its own shadows. The voice on the other end belonged to Commissioner Diego Mendoza, and his usually steady baritone carried an edge she hadn't heard in their 15 years of collaboration. "Valentina, we need you at the crime scene. Now. There's something unusual. The killer left a message, but it's not like anything we've seen before." The drive through empty streets took her past closed shops and late-night delivery trucks, the city's pulse reduced to its most essential rhythm. The crime scene was in an upscale building in Puerto Madero, where Buenos Aires tried hardest to forget its complicated past and embrace a sanitized future. Police cars clustered around the entrance like moths around a dying flame, their blue lights painting the glass facades in cold, rhythmic waves. Valentina grabbed her leather jacket against the unseasonable chill of late summer and made her way through the security perimeter. The victim was Marcus Rodriguez, 42, a successful tech entrepreneur who'd made his fortune developing apps that promised to simplify modern life. His body lay in his home office, positioned with unsettling precision in his ergonomic chair, facing his wall of achievements and accolades. There was no sign of struggle, no chaos that typically accompanied violent death. If not for the thin line of blood from a precise wound at the base of his skull, he might have been sleeping, but it was what surrounded him that made Valentina's breath catch in her throat. The walls were covered in handwritten text, neat cursive script that flowed like water across the white surfaces, not random ravings or typical killer manifestos, but what appeared to be session notes from a therapy appointment. "Patient exhibits classic symptoms of survivor's guilt," one section read. "The subject cannot reconcile his success with his brother's failure. He builds walls of achievement to hide from the child who couldn't save his sibling from drowning in the Rio de la Plata." Another passage continued. "Marcus tells himself the story that hard work equals worthiness, but at 3 a.m., when the city sleeps, he knows the truth. He survived by accident, thrived by luck, and no amount of success can change the fundamental randomness of who lives and who dies." Mendoza stood beside her, his graying mustache twitching with nervous energy. "The victim's brother did die in a drowning accident 28 years ago. We verified it. How could the killer know these intimate details? There's no therapist on record, no psychiatric treatment in his history." Valentina moved closer to the wall, her trained eye catching patterns in the seemingly random placement of the text. "This isn't just knowledge," she said quietly. "This is interpretation. Whoever wrote this understands psychological methodology, cognitive behavioral frameworks, even psychoanalytic theory. Look at the language choices, the technical precision mixed with emotional insight." She photographed each wall methodically while the forensic team worked around her. In the corner of the room, almost hidden behind a bookshelf, she found something that made her pulse quicken. A small note, different from the others, written on official-looking stationery that seemed familiar. "Dr. Arce, I've been waiting for someone who could understand. The city is sick, and I'm merely documenting the symptoms. This is session 1. The patient is Buenos Aires itself, and you, doctor, are the only one qualified to provide treatment. Let's begin with Marcus, who wore his trauma like designer clothing, visible to all but recognized by none." The morning sun was beginning to paint the city gold by the time Valentina returned to her apartment. She spread the crime scene photos across her dining table, the victim's story laid out like a psychological autopsy. Her cat, Borges, watched from his perch on the bookshelf, seemingly judging her descent back into the darkness she'd tried to leave behind. 3 years ago, she'd stepped back from active crime consultation after the Recoleta strangler case had nearly broken her. The killer had targeted therapists, forcing her to confront the possibility that her profession, dedicated to healing, could be twisted into something monstrous. She'd thought she was done with killers who played psychological games. But this was different. This killer wasn't targeting therapists, they were thinking like one. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former mentor, Dr. Isabel Cortázar, now retired and living in Mendoza. Saw the news. The methodology seems familiar, doesn't it? Remember what I taught you about projection. Sometimes the message isn't about the victim. Isabel had always pushed Valentina to look deeper, to see patterns where others saw chaos. She'd been the one to recognize Valentina's gift for criminal psychology when she was just a university student struggling to make sense of her own trauma. The loss of her younger sister to suicide, a death that had shaped her entire career path. That evening, Valentina sat in Café Tortoni, the historic coffeehouse where Buenos Aires' intellectual elite had debated and dreamed for over a century. The tango music from the upper floor drifted down like smoke, mixing with the smell of coffee and media lunas. She'd chosen a corner table, her back to the wall, a habit developed from years of studying predators. The waiter, an elderly man who'd probably served coffee through multiple economic crises and political upheavals, brought her usual cortado and 3 media lunas without being asked. This city had a memory, and sometimes that memory was comforting, sometimes suffocating. She spread her notes before her, trying to build a profile. The killer was educated, certainly. Medical knowledge to execute such a precise death, psychological training evident in the written analysis, and an intimate knowledge of the victim's history that suggested either long-term surveillance or inside information. But there was something else, something in the tone of the writing that felt personal, almost confessional. The killer wasn't just analyzing Marcus Rodriguez. They were sharing their own pain through the lens of his trauma. Her phone rang. Mendoza's voice was tighter than before. "Valentina, we found something. Marcus Rodriguez had a connection to your sister, Carmen. They were in the same support group for depression years ago before—" He trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. Valentina felt the coffee turn to acid in her stomach. Carmen had been in several support groups in her final months, searching for something to hold on to as she slipped further into darkness. The idea that this victim had known her sister, had perhaps heard her final thoughts, made this case suddenly, viscerally personal. The second body was discovered 4 days later in a renovated warehouse in San Telmo, the neighborhood where Buenos Aires' history pressed against its present like old lovers unable to let go. The victim was Ana Lucia Vega, 35, a social worker who dedicated her life to helping torture survivors from the military dictatorship era. Like Marcus, she was positioned with care, seated at her desk, surrounded by the files of people she'd tried to heal. And like Marcus, the walls around her were covered in the killer's distinctive handwriting. "Subject presence with classic hero complex," the wall read. Ana Lucia believes that by saving others, she can retroactively save her grandfather, who disappeared in 1978. Every success is a small victory against historical trauma, every failure a confirmation that some wounds never heal. She collects broken people like others collect stamps, each one a chance to rewrite an ending that was determined before she was born. But healing others is not the same as healing oneself. And at night, when the city remembers it's disappeared, she knows she's just another ghost trying to convince herself she's alive. Valentina stood in the converted loft, the exposed brick walls now covered in psychological insights that cut deeper than any physical wound. The killer had known about Ana Lucia's grandfather, had understood the weight of inherited trauma that pressed down on so many Argentine families. The precision of the psychological analysis was remarkable, but it was the empathy in it that disturbed Valentina most. This wasn't the work of a psychopath devoid of feeling. This was someone who understood pain intimately, who perhaps even shared it. A new note waited for her, tucked into one of Ana Lucia's case files. Dr. Arte, Session 2 explores intergenerational trauma. How fitting for our city, where the past refuses to stay buried and the present is always negotiating with ghosts. Ana Lucia tried to be a bridge between then and now, but bridges can be lonely places, suspended between 2 points, but belonging to neither. You understand this, don't you? Your sister also tried to be a bridge between sanity and madness, between hope and despair. She fell into the gap between. The mention of Carmen sent ice through Valentina's veins. She'd never publicly discussed her sister's suicide, had kept that pain locked away in a professional vault. How did the killer know? She thought of all the crime scenes she'd analyzed, all the killers she'd profiled, and realized with growing unease that someone had been profiling her in return. Every case she'd worked, every public appearance, every paper she'd published, someone had been studying her the way she studied others. Back at the police station, she worked with Mendoza's team to find connections between the victims. Both had been involved in mental health services, both carried family trauma, both had tried to transform pain into purpose. But Buenos Aires was full of such people. Trauma was practically the city's unofficial currency. The killer's selection seemed deliberate, but the pattern remained opaque. Valentina found herself thinking about the concept of the wounded healer, the therapist who enters the profession to heal their own psychological wounds. Both victims fit this archetype in their own ways, as did she. That night, unable to sleep, she walked through the streets of her neighborhood. Palermo at 2 a.m. was a different creature than during the day, quieter but never silent, the bars closing down while the early morning workers began their routines. She found herself at the Bosque de Palermo, the sprawling park where she used to walk with Carmen during her sister's better periods. They'd feed the ducks at the lake, pretending things were normal, that the medication was working, that tomorrow would be better than today. The last time they'd walked here, Carmen had said something that now echoed with new meaning. "Val, what if the real sickness isn't in the people who break, but in the world that breaks them?" Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown number. "Dr. Ars, you're walking in circles, literally and figuratively. The pattern isn't in the victims, it's in the treatment. Each death is a failed therapy session, a demonstration of what happens when we try to heal wounds that society keeps reopening. Would you like to understand? Meet me where your sister said goodbye. Come alone, or don't come at all." The location was clear. The bridge over the train tracks in Collegiales where Carmen had ended her life. Valentina knew she should call Mendoza, should bring backup, should follow protocol. But the killer had been 3 steps ahead from the beginning, and traditional police work wasn't going to solve this. Besides, this had become personal in a way that transcended professional obligation. She needed to understand not just who was killing, but why these deaths felt like messages written specifically for her. She arrived at the bridge at 3 a.m., the same time Carmen had jumped 5 years ago. The city sprawled below, a constellation of lights and lives, each carrying their own secret darknesses. A figure stood at the far end of the bridge, backlit by street lamps, face obscured. "Dr. Ars!" The voice was cultured, educated, neither clearly male nor female. "Thank you for coming. I've been studying your work for years. Your paper on trauma transference, your analysis of the Recoleta strangler, your beautiful understanding of how pain moves through families like a virus. But you've been asking the wrong questions about these deaths." "Then tell me the right questions," Valentina said, her hand on the pepper spray in her pocket, though she suspected it would be useless. The figure laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "The question isn't who dies, but who watches them die. The question isn't what trauma they carried, but who profits from that trauma." Marcus Rodriguez and Ana Lucia Vega weren't random, Dr. Arce. They were part of a system that monetizes pain, that turns suffering into careers, that creates an economy of healing that requires a steady supply of the wounded. The figure on the bridge stepped forward, and Valentina finally saw a face, young, androgynous, marked by a sadness that seemed etched into bone. "My name is Gabriel," they said, "though names matter less than roles, don't they? I was Dr. Patricia Echeverria's patient for 3 years. You remember her, don't you? The psychiatrist who killed herself last year? Valentina remembered. Patricia had been found in her office, surrounded by the files of patients she couldn't save, her final note reading simply, "I failed them all." Gabriel continued, their voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who told their story many times but never been truly heard. Dr. Echeverria treated 17 patients who eventually took their own lives. 17 failures that she catalogued meticulously, trying to understand where treatment became harm. Your sister was one of them. So was my partner, Tomas. So was Ana Lucia Vega's brother, though she never knew they shared that connection. We were all part of an experimental treatment program, using new combinations of therapy and medication, funded by pharmaceutical companies that needed data on vulnerable populations. The revelation hit Valentina like a physical blow. Carmen had mentioned a new treatment program in her final months, something innovative that promised better results than traditional therapy. Valentina had been so desperate for anything that might help that she hadn't asked enough questions. "You're killing people connected to that program?" she asked, though even as she said it, she knew it was more complex than simple revenge. "I'm documenting the truth that everyone refuses to see," Gabriel said. "Each death is a case study in how trauma gets institutionalized, commodified, transformed into profit margins and research papers." Marcus Rodriguez's company was developing an app to gamify mental health treatment, turning suffering into data points and achievements. Ana Lucia was unknowingly referring vulnerable clients to programs that used them as test subjects. They were cogs in a machine that grinds up the wounded and produces statistics. A police siren wailed in the distance, and Gabriel smiled sadly. "You called them after all. I expected that. But before they arrive, you need to know the rest. There's going to be one more death, Dr. Arce. One more session to complete the treatment. But I'm leaving the choice to you. You can let them arrest me now, and the story ends with a disturbed individual taking revenge for personal loss. Or you can look deeper, follow the money, expose the system that creates killers like me by first creating victims like your sister." The police cars were getting closer, their lights beginning to paint the underside of the bridge in blue and red. Valentina found herself at a crossroads that had nothing to do with the immediate situation. Gabriel was a killer, that was undeniable. But they were also evidence of a deeper sickness, a symptom of systematic failures that she'd been unwilling to see because she was part of that system. Her entire career had been built on the premise that understanding could lead to healing. But what if understanding without action was just another form of complicity? "Who's the third victim?" she asked. Gabriel pulled out a folder thick with documents and handed it to her. "Dr. Roberto Kuczynski, the psychiatrist who designed the experimental program. He's presenting at a conference tomorrow at the Hilton, celebrating the commercial success of treatments built on our dead. The wall text is already written, documenting every patient he failed, every corner cut for profit, every suffering transformed into a publication. But I'm giving you the chance to stop me, to choose between justice and law, between healing and procedure." The police burst onto the bridge, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Gabriel raised their hands slowly, making no sudden movements. As they were forced to the ground and handcuffed, they kept their eyes on Valentina. "Session 3, Dr. Arce, the choice is yours. Will you be the therapist who maintains the system, or the one who breaks it?" The folder in her hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, filled with evidence that could either be buried in legal proceedings or exposed to destroy careers and save lives. Mendoza approached her as Gabriel was led away. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" Valentina shook her head, clutching the folder. "Diego, I need to tell you something about this case. It's bigger than we thought. It connects to my sister, to dozens of deaths, to people in power who've been experimenting on vulnerable populations." Mendoza's expression darkened. "Val, be careful. You know how these things go in this city. Some stones are better left unturned." But Valentina thought of Carmen, of her final note that had simply said, "The treatment became the disease." She thought of Marcus Rodriguez trying to digitize healing while drowning in his own unprocessed grief. Of Ana Lucia, attempting to heal historical wounds while bleeding from fresh ones. Of Gabriel, transformed from patient to killer by a system that failed them at every turn. The pattern was clear now, not in the victims, but in the victimization itself, the way trauma became currency in an economy of suffering. That night, she sat in her apartment, the contents of Gabriel's folder spread across her floor. Medical records, financial documents, email exchanges between pharmaceutical executives discussing acceptable loss rates, research proposals that treated human pain as data to be harvested. Dr. Roberto Kuczynski's name appeared on every document, the architect of a program that had a 40% suicide rate but was considered successful because the surviving 60% showed improvement on standardized metrics. Her sister had been part of the 40%, a statistical sacrifice for the greater good of publishable results. The conference at the Hilton was titled Innovation in Mental Health, Buenos Aires Leading the Way Forward. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Valentina as she stood outside the gleaming hotel, watching attendees stream in with their lanyards and tablet computers, ready to network over coffee and suffering. She'd spent the night making copies of Gabriel's documents, sending them to journalists she trusted, to international human rights organizations, to anyone who might listen. But she also knew that Gabriel was somewhere in this building, ready to complete their trilogy of death. She found Dr. Roberto Kuczynski in the green room, preparing for his keynote speech. He was a small man with perfectly styled silver hair and eyes that reminded her of winter, cold and distant. "Doctor, Argue," he said with surprise that quickly shifted to calculation. "I heard you were consulting on these unfortunate deaths. Terrible business. Mental health professionals being targeted. It undermines public trust in our entire field." His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone who'd learned to navigate around truth without ever quite lying. "I know about the program, Roberto," she said quietly. "About Carmen. About all of them. Gabriel gave me everything." His face went through several micro-expressions. Surprise, fear, then settling on resignation. "Gabriel Romano. Yes, I wondered when that particular ghost would materialize. Brilliant patient, too intelligent for their own good. They could never accept that progress requires sacrifice, that medicine advances through trial and error, that some patients are beyond help regardless of intervention. The casual dismissal of human life, including her sister's, ignited something in Valentina that transcended professional detachment. They weren't beyond help. They were betrayed by people they trusted, used as test subjects for treatments that prioritized profit over healing. You turned their pain into publications, their deaths into data points. Kuczynski adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed his composure. "And what would you have me do? Stop trying to innovate because some patients don't respond well. Every medical advance comes with casualties. Your sister was deeply ill, Dr. Aas. If not my program, something else would have triggered her eventual outcome." The conference was starting. Hundreds of mental health professionals gathering to hear about the future of their field. Valentina could hear Kuczynski being called to the stage. She had a choice. Let him speak and preserve the illusion of professional progress, or expose the rot at the heart of their profession. Gabriel was right about one thing. Understanding without action was just another form of complicity. She thought about the walls covered in psychological insights at the crime scenes, each one a mirror reflecting not just the victims, but the entire system that created and consumed them. "I'm going to give you a choice, Roberto," she said, unconsciously echoing Gabriel's words to her. "You can go out there and give your presentation, and I'll release everything to the media during your speech. Or you can announce your resignation, admit to the failures of the program, and use your platform to expose the systemic issues that led to these deaths. Either way, the truth comes out today." His face had gone pale, the winter in his eyes turning to panic. "You can't do this. You'll destroy everything we've built, undermine public faith in mental health treatment. People will suffer without access to care." "People are suffering because of the care they're receiving," Valentina countered. "The system is sick, Roberto, and we're the symptoms. Every therapist who burns out, every patient who doesn't improve, every suicide that gets classified as a treatment failure rather than a system failure, we're all part of the same disease." She could see him calculating, looking for an escape route, but they both knew she had him cornered. The evidence was too comprehensive, the connections too clear. Security burst through the door. Mendoza had figured out the likely target and mobilized units to the hotel. "Dr. Ash, we need to evacuate the building. We have credible intelligence that Gabriel Romano is on the premises." But Valentina knew Gabriel wasn't coming. The third death, the final session, wasn't going to be physical. It was going to be professional, reputational, the death of a system that had failed so many. Gabriel had given her the weapon. The choice to use it was hers. On stage, with hundreds watching, Roberto Kuczynski began his presentation. But instead of his prepared remarks about innovation and progress, he started with a confession. "I stand before you today to discuss a different kind of innovation. The innovative ways we've failed our patients, monetized their suffering, and hidden our failures behind statistics and jargon." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that precedes either revelation or disaster. Valentina watched from the back as he laid out the truth about the experimental program, about the deaths classified as acceptable losses, about the pharmaceutical money that influenced treatment protocols. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some attendees walked out in disgust, others demanded more information, a few began sharing their own stories of systemic failures they'd witnessed but never reported. The conference dissolved into something between a confession booth and a revolution, mental health professionals finally acknowledging the shadows they'd been trained to ignore. Mendoza found Valentina in the chaos. "Gabriel Romano is dead," he said quietly. "Suicide by medication, timed precisely with the start of this conference. They left a note saying the treatment was complete." That evening, Valentina stood again on the bridge where Carmen had died, where Gabriel had revealed the truth, where she'd made the choice that changed everything. The city sprawled below, still carrying its cargo of trauma and hope, but something had shifted. The story was out now, spreading through social media and news outlets, forcing conversations that had been avoided for too long. She thought about the messages on the walls, the psychological insights that had seemed like violations, but were actually desperate attempts at communication. Her phone rang. It was Isabel, her mentor. "I saw the news. You did the right thing, Valentina. Sometimes healing requires opening wounds that have been sutured too quickly. Your sister would be proud." Valentina wasn't sure about that. Carmen had been too gentle for such dramatic gestures. But perhaps that gentleness had been part of the problem, the willingness to accept treatment that was actually harm, to trust systems that didn't deserve trust. In her apartment, she began writing. Not a police report or a psychological profile, but something new. A manifesto for therapeutic revolution, a call for mental health professionals to examine their own complicity in the systems that create and perpetuate trauma. The killer who left messages only a psychologist could decode had been understood, but the real message wasn't in the words on the walls. It was in the silence between therapist and patient, the unspoken acknowledgement that sometimes the treatment was part of the disease, that healing required not just individual intervention, but systemic change. Buenos Aires continued its nocturnal dance of tango and trouble, a city that never fully healed from its wounds, but learned to dance with them. Valentina closed her laptop and stood at her window, watching the lights flicker like synapses in a vast urban brain. The killer's messages had been decoded, but the real work, the work of rebuilding a system that could hold trauma without exploiting it, was just beginning. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of tango music, that particularly Argentine art form that transformed pain into beauty, loss into movement. Perhaps that was the final message. Not that trauma could be cured, but that it could be transformed into something that connected rather than isolated, that revealed rather than concealed, that honored the dead by changing how we treated the living.